I think the idea of the audience, the idea of the spectator, it started to be sort of central in some of my interests. Probably because of the pandemics. I have the impression that during the pandemics, well, we missed a lot the relationship with somebody looking at what we do. And then I started to think about what sort of impact do we have with what we do in other people, you know? I started to develop a project that is called actually The Audience, and it's a collection of 3 films where the focus is on the audience and the impact of a theater piece has on their private lives. We are always thinking about the fictions that we produce and what's going on stage, but this time I felt that it was more interesting or relevant to think about, well, what's going on in the audience and which sort of impact keeps with them after to see a theater piece. So basically I developed these 3 films telling the story of a fictional audience. The starting point of the films is equal. We produced one in Buenos Aires, another one in Athens, and another one in Brussels. And the structure is the same. It's a group of spectators who goes to see a theater piece that we don't see. And we follow 11 or 12 spectators during the next 24 hours. Just to see how much that theater piece that they saw changed their private lives. And the only common point in between these different stories is that at one point all of them tell to somebody else, you know, I went to see a theater piece yesterday, and they retell one fragment of the piece that they see and we didn't. And through the narration of these characters, we get to know this fictional piece that is the core of the film. And I think to think about the audience, it also makes me reflect about how ephemeral theater is, which is something pretty obvious and we all know that. But on the other hand, the idea of what remains from theater pieces and in which way we also transform them by retelling them, it's also something that interests me a lot. Probably because many of my pieces are based on the idea of storytelling and how much we change the past by telling it again. You know, we all change our life and our past every time that we retell it. And somehow the idea of a group of spectators or any spectator telling you something that they saw, it's also a way of recreate this piece, to transform it, you know, because there's no 2 spectators that will tell about the theater piece in the same way, and the impact is different. So this idea of being a spectator of a fiction and also a creator of a new fiction every time that you retell what you have seen, it's something that interests me a lot. I personally, I'm a sort of a chaotic spectator because I try to see as many things as I can, films, theater, or to read as many books as I can. I try not to follow a specific line and to be as open as I can, also because being a theater director, I try to have as many influences as I can and not to just focus on one thing. But again, I also pay a lot of attention to the way I tell to somebody else how it was something that I saw, because then I notice that this is probably the point 0 of the fiction, you know? It's like telling somebody else something, it's creating a new fiction, and that could be potentially something that I will, you know, steal and to use in a different way for some of my performances as well. I'm basically a theater director. I studied cinema in the long past, and I think I've been always fascinated about how to take some procedures from film into theater. It's not very usual that I use films into my theater piece. Los años, the years, the piece that we're going to present at Piccolo, it's a little bit an exception because it's true that they are, well, it's the story of a documentary filmmaker. The main character is a documentary filmmaker. So there is a sort of a film inside the theater piece. But that's not something that I usually do. I much more prefer to take certain concepts or ideas from film and to try to find a very theatrical way to use it. For example, in some previous pieces, or even in the past, in Los Años, we have like two sets that are visible at the same time, which is a very classical cinematic, split screen procedure, but we use it in a very theatrical way. Or we might take, like a revolving stage during one piece that it might resemble like a long shot in a film, but made with very theatrical means. And then, in the case of the films, I think I tried to take more some elements of the storytelling of the theater and the idea of representation, but probably not as much the aesthetic of the theatricality into film. I think I'm much more interested in to see how film can influence theater than rather the other way around. I think I'm much more interested in to explore the limit of fictions, or to think about politically the way that we produce fiction, rather than to include a very clear political issues into the piece that I developed. On the other hand, I'm very aware of work such as Milo Rau or Rimini Protocol or even Lola Arias, and I'm much more interested in that. My question is how to produce fiction after documentary theater, for example, or how we can produce fiction taking in account documentary theater. There are a lot of political issues that are being addressed in some of our pieces, probably in a slightly different way that some activist theater will do. For example, in Los Años, well, it's, as I said, one of the main lines, it's the story of a documentary filmmaker who is making a documentary about a kid who lives in a sort of a slum in Argentina. He's a middle-class filmmaker, and he's trying to make a portrait of this kid who lives in the margins of the society. So it's a sort of reflection of how a middle-class person can or can't at all make representation of somebody who lives in a completely different social environment. And also how much that will transform the reality of that person who is represented. Especially in the case of the piece that we are going to present at Piccolo, I think something that is really inside the piece is the idea of the future. It's a piece that happens in two different times, in 2020 and in 2050. So the idea of future is very present, and we are seeing both times at the same time, and you can see the same character actually in both times. And I think to make a reflection on the idea of future through fictions, it's also include a political reflection, in the sense that I have the feeling that we need to reclaim the right to think about the future and to imagine how is going to be the future, and also to think, well, how this time, how our present is going to be remembered in the future, or which things are we going to tell from this time in 30 years, or how much our societies are going to change in the next 30 years. Those things, those issues are things that are revolving or floating around the piece that we are going to present here. And actually, that's something that changed quite a lot during the pandemic, because originally we wanted to create a piece that reflected more the life of the same character in two different times, you know, and originally I think the idea of making, to tell the story of the older character was more to tell the story of the character in the old character in the present and the younger in the past, like now and in the 90s. But then during the pandemic, we had the impression that it was much more interesting to start to think about the future and rather to think about the past again, to again thinking about the future. And in that sense, I have the impression that in recent times, capitalism has been very successful in to sell the idea that there's no other way to organize a society rather than capitalism, which is something that we don't believe at all in the company. So again, the idea of thinking about the future and thinking about fictionally about the future, it's a sort of invitation to also think collectively about, well, how is going to be that future? And perhaps the idea that the future could be better because we can imagine it. So in that sense, I would say that our piece is quite political. I worked in the context of a collective. I'm part of the Grupo Marea, that's how I call ourselves. We have a strange way to organize our creations, because it's true that I'm the playwright and the director, but I discuss all the ideas with the rest of the group from the very beginning. The group is composed by a set designer, a producer, a musician, a light designer, and myself. The performers change in every show because first of all, because in Argentina we don't really have the tradition of company as you might have in Europe. It's more like a collection of people who decides to do something together, rather than a traditional company system. And on the other hand, also because we tend to work sometimes in a stage performance, such as this one. Sometimes it's more in the format of a film or an installation or a site-specific. So it might change a lot for each project. But it's true that from the very beginning, I start to discuss ideas, concepts, or text with the rest of the group. And because of their feedback, I start to change a lot of the approach to each new piece. That's also the reason why I never gave a text to another director to direct one of my pieces. I don't think that would be possible, because it's so intertwined, it's so mingled, the way I write a piece to the way we create the staging, the specific staging of that piece, that is something very difficult to separate. We usually have the text written in advance before starting the rehearsals, and then it comes a long period of rehearsals or exploration with the performance, with the actresses and the actors. Also because sometimes my text resemble more a collection of short stories or some short novel rather than traditional playwriting. So the first challenge with the actors is to find the theatricality on those texts, and we spent quite a lot of time exploring the ideas, the text, and then there is like a long period of rewriting while rehearsing. And that's usually the way of how we work with the company in Argentina. I think there is a strong need to reflect about how we can organize a different society, and how can we relate to each other in a different way rather than the way that we are doing now. And indeed, theater, it's a fantastic way to do it. It's probably the only form of art where you can share a space and time with somebody else, and where you feel that what is being presented is being transformed by the one who is a spectator. Also because the spectator in theater has much more conscience of being a spectator rather than in other forms of art. So it's also the idea of, are you a spectator of the reality, or you can transform also the reality? For me, it's very interesting that there are certain times in societies where, if you think about revolutions, you might say that there are times where people stopped being a spectator and they decide to become actors of history somehow. And it's a very theatrical metaphor. And in that sense, I really believe that theater, it's an extremely good medium to reflect about current issues. In a very specific example, in the piece that we are making here, we are reflecting about the future. We are imagining a future, sometimes also using humor. It's not such a serious piece, even though if we might address some serious topics. But for example, we try to imagine, well, how could be the future of Argentina in the next 30 years? And we are very pessimistic about that. We are Argentinians and we are always pessimistic. For example, we imagine that there's going to be a far-right party who's going to take over power in the next 30 years, who is the party of the new colony, who proposed to become a colony of Spain again for Argentina. So it's going back like 300 years. And in 2050, there is a huge trend of trying to represent things as they were in the colony. But on the other hand, there are very positive things. For example, we imagine that theater is the big form of art of the future, because nobody wants something recorded anymore. Nobody wants a Zoom again. Everybody wants to be something live. Indeed, I really believe that theater, I mean, it's a very simplistic and probably a too romantic idea, but I really believe that theater has a lot of things to say in the present time. I really believe that it's very relevant now, as it always was, but probably in the current situation much more than ever. And I also felt in Argentina during the pandemic this lack of the theater. You know, we were full of film series and things online, but the need to share a space and time with somebody else and to tell us stories live, that's something that is irreplaceable. And yeah, it's something that is going to be quite relevant in the future, I guess.